what are some of the inner experiences that we humans share, or most humans share, I should say?
Well, that would seem like an easy question, but it's not. I think people are actually very different from each other. And so I think it might be the best answer to that question might be there are no inner experiences that people share. There are inner experiences that some subset of people share and other inner experiences that some other subset of people share. But I'm a little reluctant to say that there is some universal inner experience.
Amazing.
If that's what your question was,
it's a perfect question, and it drives to the heart of it. So let's rephrase it then. What are the most common features of human experience?
Well, that would seem like an easy question too. But what I would say is, first off, that inner experience is very tied to the situation, and so there is no universality in any inner experience, because now here I'm talking to you, and I've never talked to you before, and so there's going to be something about this experience which is going to be different from anything that I've ever done, and that you've ever done, et cetera. So everything starts with uniqueness. But that said, I would say that we have identified what we call the 5FP, or 5 frequent phenomena, which I think is probably the question that you were trying to get me to answer. And
no, the way you answered it was perfectly, because it sets up the rest of the call well. But yes, let's go into the 5.
Okay, so there are 5 phenomena that I would say happen fairly frequently, and by fairly frequently, I would say of all the samples that I've collected over some number of decades now, a sort of a quarter or a third of them have one or another or several of these 5 frequent phenomena. And one of them is inner speaking, which some people call inner speech, which I think is a mistake, but I call it inner speaking. People are in some way talking to themselves in a silent voice. So that's one. Number 2 is visual imagery, what I call inner seeing. It's seeing something that's not there. Some people call it having an image. I think that's a mistake too, but let's call it inner seeing for now. The third is feelings. So people do experience emotions. So my technical term for the experience of emotion is feelings. Most people think about it, call it that as well. So I'm not unique in that regard. But the point that I'm making there is that you can have emotions without experiencing them, or you can experience emotions, and those are 2 different things. And then the fourth is what I call sensory awareness. And sensory awareness is noticing the sensory quality of something, not for its instrumental value, but because for whatever reason, I'm just drawn to the sensory aspect. So if I'm going out a door and I reach for the doorknob and I notice the gold glint of the gold handle, that's sensory awareness. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I'm going to open the door. I'm going to open the door whether the handle was black, brown, or whatever, but I am drawn to the goldness of it. That is the sensory awareness. So sensory awareness in my lingo is this non-instrumental interest in sensory things. And the sensory things could be exterior, like colors and sounds or whatever, interior, stomach ache or tickle or whatever. And then the fifth of the 5FP is what I call unsymbolized thinking. And unsymbolized thinking is the direct experience of thinking. So I apprehend my thinking. I am thinking, and I'm thinking about something. I know exactly what it is that I'm thinking about, but there are no words and no imagery and no whatever that carry that. So I might be thinking, should I have a hot dog or a hamburger for lunch? And I know myself to be, I recognize myself, what I call directly apprehend myself to be thinking about whether I should have a hot dog or a hamburger for lunch, but there's no word hot dog and no word hamburger and no picture, no mental picture or whatever of either one of those things. That's what I call unsymbolized thinking.
Right.
So those five things, those 5 characteristics occur frequently enough across people that I think, well, if this is an example of that, we might as well call it the same thing every time. Like, for example, inner speaking.
So what was your initial apprehension to the way I phrased the question initially? So I think most people listening to this podcast will have heard those 5 things and have at least some recognition that, yes, I do that, yes, I do that, and I do that. And maybe they're wrong, which we'll get into. But what is it that's varying between people on those 5 things that makes them so rare and so variable?
I'm not sure that I understand that question. Let me answer the question that I think as I understand it, and then you can tell me whether that's really what you wanted to know. There are people who engage in inner speaking. Let's take inner speaking as an example. There are people who engage in inner speaking, some of whom do it pretty much all the time. So if I give somebody a beeper and I beep them 100 times, 90 of them or 95 of them or something involves some kind of inner speaking. And then there are other people who don't do that at all. You can give them 100 beeps and they get 0 inner speaking. And those, what makes things complicated, and this is what I'm taking your question to be, what makes that complicated is that both of those people might have said prior to sampling, I talk to myself all the time.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
And the reason for that is that the language that people use to describe their own inner experience is not very well differentiated. So people use what would be interpersonally a sloppy linguistic conventions, I guess, because they've never had to describe it. They say, I'm talking to myself. What they really mean is that they're somehow considering something, and they call it talking to themselves because they've heard other people say talking to themselves. And so they think, well, I'm talking to myself. But then when I come along and at the moment of the beep and they say I was talking to myself and I ask, well, what exactly were you saying? Excuse me. On the possibility or the probability that if somebody is talking, they're saying something. And then their answer to that is, well, I don't know exactly what I was talking to myself. I was thinking about having a hamburger or a hot dog or whatever. And I would say, well, what exactly were the words that you were using? And they would say, well, I don't know. And I would say, well, I'm interested in words, among things. And so if you're using words, if you're talking to yourself, I'd like to know exactly what those words are. So next time when you wear the beeper, if you're using words, I would like to know what they are. And so the next time you wear the beeper and you come back and you say, well, I was thinking about going to the grocery. I was talking to myself about going to the grocery store. And I would say, well, what exactly were you saying? And then you would say, well, I'm not really sure. I needed to get milk and bread. And I said, well, what did you say? I need to get milk and bread. And you would say, well, I'm not really sure about that. I said, well, I'm interested in words. So if you're talking to yourself, I'd like to know what those words were. And then on the third day, you'd come back and you'd say, I've been saying I was talking to myself, but I haven't really been talking to myself. If you use talk in the way you and most other people use talk, which is to say one word after another, that's what people mean by talk. If that's what you mean by talk, then I wasn't talking to myself.
Right.
So it takes roughly 3 sampling days for people to realize that the language that they've been applying to themselves is not the same language that they would use it in the external world.
Right. So it only takes a little bit of interrogation for someone to realize that how they're categorizing their inner experiences might not actually be accurate. And people can hold beliefs about themselves their whole lives saying, of course I have an inner monologue. Of course I do this. Of course I do that. But it's just because they're not really called upon to actually recall that experience in great detail very often or ever.
And it's the or ever part.
Yeah.
So you're right. It takes a little bit. It doesn't really take that much. It takes 2 or 3 sampling days. So it doesn't take much, but it takes a careful process.
Let's explain that process so you understand with the bleepers so that everyone understands exactly what you mean there.
So if you're a subject of my research, I give you a beeper, and which is basically a device with an earphone, more or less like this, and you go into your everyday environment wearing a beeper, wearing an earphone. And at random times that I don't control and you don't control, it will beep, and that beep sounds beep. You push a button on the beeper to stop the beep, but your task is to pay attention to what was going on, what I sometimes call 1 microsecond just before the beep began. What was happening in your inner experience before it was disturbed by the beep? As if there was like a parallel universe that was exactly the same as this universe, except there was no beeper. And so at this particular microsecond in this universe, when the thing beeped, go to this other universe without the beeper. What was heaven experiencing right then?
Right.
And jot down some notes about that and get a half a dozen beeps, and then we'll get together and talk about those sometime soon. And by sometime soon, I mean like today or maybe tomorrow, within one sleep cycle, I guess is the way I might describe it. We're going to get together and talk about those 6 beeps. And by talk about it, I'm going to say, well, Evan, what was in your experience at the moment of the first beep? And by at the moment of, I mean 1 microsecond just before the beep occurred. And then you'll try to tell me, and I will say, well, I don't understand what you mean. Like I just was saying, well, you said you were talking to yourself. What words were you using? If you said you were talking to yourself, I would ask, what words were you using? And if you said, well, I was imagining something, I would say, well, what exactly were you imagining, and how did that imagining go? Whatever you said, I would try to understand what you meant about your inner experience. And we would decide on that first day that you weren't very good at it. And that's not a criticism of Evan, because nobody's very good at it, because nobody has actually had to describe what their inner experience was. And so we would agree. It isn't like I would be saying, you're not very good at this, Evan, and you'd be saying, oh, yes, I am. I would be saying, well, you're not very good at this, Evan, and you would be saying, yeah, I know, I wasn't very good at it. And so, well, we would say, let's see whether we can do it better tomorrow. And then you'll wear the beaver again tomorrow, and we'll try it again. And then the next day and do the same thing. And that process, which I call the iterative process, and I use iterative like a mathematician would use iterative, which means a slightly better approximation each time until you finally get to what you're looking for.
Right.
By that iterative process, we would get better. You would get better at describing your inner experience, and I would get better at asking questions about your inner experience. And I think for most people, we would get a higher fidelity view of what your undisturbed, what I call pristine inner experience is.
I'm curious, what comes to mind there when you talk about people never having to recall their inner experience is meditators, very good meditators, even master meditators, where some of that exercise is being very aware of your experience, noticing the draft of wind on your left elbow, noticing the thoughts that come in, knowing how to get rid of those thoughts. Have you ever done this experience sampling exercise with a meditator who has had to, even daily think about their inner experience and get good at controlling it and regulating it and all the other things that they do?
Yes, I have sampled with, I think, 3 what you would call world-class meditators, people who teach meditation, who have a reputation for being meditators. And their inner experience at the moment of the beep is very much like what you just described. They notice the cool breeze on their left elbow or something like that, which I would call sensory awareness. That is a good example of sensory awareness, perfect example of sensory awareness. And what I have found in my very small sample of meditators is that they have a lot of sensory awareness, and they're good at describing it pretty much on the first day. And they would say that they find the method, my descriptive experience sampling method, better. All 3 of them actually find it as better than the method that they use to teach meditation.
Interesting.
Because the meditation, the good meditative situations are, there's a gong over there somewhere. When the gong goes off, you're supposed to pay attention to your inner experience, but the gong isn't a very good signal, really, because A, it's over there, and B, it doesn't have a fast rise time. It goes, where in that was your experience? Whereas my beeps are beep, and they're always in your ear, so that there's.
If you enjoyed that short podcast clip and you're interested in learning more about our inner experience, because how could you not? It's just so damn fascinating. Then check out my full conversation with Dr. Russell Hurlburt here. It was incredible. 50 years of experience doing this. Insane. Watch it here. You will not regret it.